coming from a media's perspective, how do you think this specific picture, this specific footages become such a focus of the world's attention? Can people really make a change with images like this?
Well, this image has already resulted in a ceasefire. I mean, whether it's genuine or sincere or not is another story, but it has generated at least a temporary stop to some of the bombings. But it does bring an interesting question. What is the context of the conflict? Sometimes images do create immediate policy implications. If you look at the napalm picture from 1965 of a young girl in Vietnam, that galvanized a lot of American domestic opposition to the Vietnam War. If you go back to China 80 years when the Japanese attacked China, you have an iconic picture of a baby in a flaming city, alone and burned, and that picture galvanized a lot of support in the United States to boycott or embargo oil to the Japanese, which sped up Japanese plans to bomb Pearl Harbor. So sometimes images do have an immediate effect, but sometimes in a complex situation like this with Assad and ISIS and people not really knowing which side is which in some regard in the United States among the general public, the impact of the image might be fleeting. We might be heartbroken and enraged, and then something else will come along. We have a very short attention span.
Mr. O'Hanlon, from a geopolitical perspective, how do you see this photo? Will that be a wake-up call? Can capitals now work together? When I asked this question, I already felt my naivete when asking it, but really, can they be a wake-up call?
Well, I think the professor, unfortunately, is correct that it's likely that our attention span won't really be sustained on this tragedy. As you know, in recent years, there have been a lot of images, some of them from Syria, like the 3-year-old boy who washed up drowned a couple of years ago or so, maybe last year, I guess, but also images of shooting victims from Paris to San Bernardino to Orlando, bombing victims in Turkey and the broader Middle East. And we just have so much of this coming at us all the time and we realize that in an era of electronic media, it happens, and it's just sort of a sampling of reality. There are other tragedies like the North Korean starvation catastrophe of the 1990s, in which 2 million people died and basically nobody saw a thing because the country was so shut off. So I think at this stage in history, people are aware that they have to, I guess the more cynical thing would be to say we have short attention spans, and that's true. But at the same time, we're also aware we can't base policy on an emotional reaction to a certain image. And I think President Obama has projected an American fatigue with the wars of the Middle East that's fairly representative of a lot of Americans, and they're thinking about what we can realistically do to stop any of these tragedies. So it's easier for Americans to just sort of shut it off. And we're not seeing much debate about this in the presidential campaign. So we have someone who will replace Mr. Obama in just a few months, but there really isn't discussion that I've heard in the presidential race about what to do about Syria. Americans just have this sense of frustration that Middle Eastern wars are not really something we're good at solving.
Right. Ms. He here in Beijing, when Mr. O'Hanlon talked about the American fatigue about the Middle East issue, there's also a fatigue in the rest of the world about our incapability of doing something, of the U.S. Indifference, as some see it, towards some of the crises in the world, and even blaming the United States for starting some of the crises. Let's just put them aside. But when the rest of the world watching this specific images of that little boy, how are we shocked? And as a result of this, are we really gonna do anything? Or it's just gonna be there for a few days and we move on to the next image, next footage?
Well, this kind of a picture, even though it's quite sad and also it's touching, I think unfortunately, yeah, it's just stay there for hours. maybe less than that. You know, when people talking about the Olympic, that's a very joyous picture, and then a lot of miserable picture, not only from Syria and from other natural disasters or earthquake, whatever. So many, and the terror attack. So so many, and the same day, even same hours, appears on the people's, in front of people's eyes. So I think there's simply people couldn't do anything about that, especially those mass people. They have no power. They are not the decision makers. But even for the decision makers sitting in the White House, I don't think those pictures, even though it's so emotional, can do any leverage on those decision makers, because simply it's because it cannot compare it with what happening like in the Vietnam War in the 1960s. That Vietnam War, because this is United States just one big power involved with that war.
So and players are very clear.
Yeah, very clear and very limited player. But this time around in Syria, there are many, many players involved in that conflicts. So you cannot imagine President Obama, if he were facing some protest on the street and give his pressure, saying must do something, get involved in the Syria war immediately to rescue the boys like that Aleppo or boy or the beach boy. So there's not that kind of thing happening.
I think two issues
nowadays.
there, Mr. O'Hanlon. One is the disconnect between the crisis realities and the policies available to handle these realities. The other thing is the constant appearance of crisis and the inability of players within crisis to be identified. Those two are not likely to change, and that's why we see, Mr. O'Hanlon, the rise of populism, of emotional politics worldwide, not to mention your presidential election in the United States. But the thing is, with this very temporary ceasefire for 2 days, can players further work on this consensus? Can a consensus now become more sustainable than it used to be, at least on the issue of Syria? Mr. O'Hanlon.
I don't think that's going to happen soon, I'm afraid, because the United States, I think, still has a contradictory policy, and Russia still has a cynical policy. What I mean by that is that we are still hoping we can somehow defeat ISIS and push President Assad from power while keeping Syria whole and cohesive, all simultaneously, with very limited American commitment of any kind of resources. That's our contradiction. Russia's cynicism is that they are willing to prop up an old friend, even at the expense of continued bombardment of civilian neighborhoods and making war against a wide range of groups, many of which are relatively moderate, but Russia and President Assad just claim they're all extreme and terroristic as an excuse for their military approach. So Russia is cynical, we are contradictory and not very committed, and therefore I don't think we're headed in a good direction. In my opinion, the United States and its allies will have to increase the resources we devote to this conflict, but simultaneously accept a lower goal for a political resolution, some kind of a confederation model in which I think President Assad could remain in charge of one part of the country. I think that's the more realistic way to deconflict the approach of Russia and the United States, but we're nowhere close to that sort of change at the moment.
Thank you very much for your analysis. Very interesting ideas. You just help us to understand it is not just cynical or cynicism about politics. It's also cynicism about how journalism has been working over the past decades. Mr. Chambers, if we look at the photograph of the 5-year-old Amran, it had brought white helmets, the rescue organization, into focus. Take a look at this. Syria's white helmets nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. While Al Jazeera described the organization as heroes, Russia Today says the Syrian boys' image shamelessly exploited for West's war agenda. And according to a report on global research released last year, the white helmets have been good at, quote, manipulating the media. Of course, there has been always continuous debate about the nature of media and where they come from, what agenda they have. But Professor Chambers, people are getting ever more cynical about media's agenda in our world today, hadn't we?
Well, very cynical, and with good reason. Media likes to, especially Western media, especially American media, which is based on a capitalist sort of model. Titillating stuff sells. Brutality and horror doesn't necessarily sell. Now, on the other hand, you have images of this boy, which he's not dead, unlike the toddler on the beach on the island in Greece. That was, for some media outlets in America, too horrific to show. People might say cynically, it wasn't titillating enough. A live toddler who is in distress is more titillating than a dead toddler. Some people are that cynical. Now, on the other hand, you do have governments that have a national interest or movements in this conflict, where somebody might say that, the white helmets are a propaganda device. That has not been proven. I don't know whether they have to prove that they aren't. However, that's part of the cynicism too, because we can't really find an objective point to measure that from, because you have governments and other forces that have one message, and you have other people have another message. So it's tough, and that does mean that maybe perhaps journalism isn't doing its job, because it should be looking for that objective point, that objective comparison point.
Right. Ms. He, very briefly from you, from a political analyst perspective, how do you see the nature of the media, particular nature of the media on this very controversial issue? Briefly.
Yeah, media can play both positive and negative role for ending or even expanding a war or conflict. So fully depend on who they represent, the interest group. So I think that's a very tricky thing. Media, if they play very good role, they can even end a war. For example, like this Somali war, when those media cover those, the Black Hawk Down, and then immediately Clinton government pulled this army out. I think that's a good sample.